Now, where we left off in talking about Islam was around the 8th century, the 700s, with this extensive empire going from Spain all the way to India and even reaching almost to China. In the year 750, some Muslims became very concerned about the apparent lack of religiosity of the ruling family at the time known as the Umayyads. The Umayyads, from the middle of the 600s or the late 600s, had been in control of the Islamic Empire. Well, there was a concern that they had become too secular, even though they wouldn't have used that term. But they're too worldly, they're not religious enough, they're not Islamic enough. And so a group of leaders, or a group of people, staged a revolt, kicking the Umayyads out of power and establishing the Abbasid dynasty. Now, the Abbasid dynasty was centered in Baghdad, in what is modern-day Iraq. And so this introduced to Islam a lot more Persian elements. So Islam has never really totally been an Arab religion solely. It has always had elements of other cultures in it as well. Relationships between this Islamic empire and at least Western Christianity were sometimes good, especially during the time of Harun al-Rashid, known in the West as Aaron the Wise. Harun al-Rashid was a caliph or a leader of the Abbasid dynasty. And if you've ever heard of the 1001 Arabian Nights, this is the Abbasid caliph who was kind of the center of that tale. It was a time in his rule of peace and prosperity, a lot of unity, but shortly after his rule, the Abbasid dynasty would start to break apart. As I mentioned, during his rule, relationships between the Islamic Empire and Western Christianity were largely good. He corresponded with Charlemagne, sent a diplomatic mission to him, and so they engaged in some diplomacy. There was technological exchange between the Muslim-controlled lands and Charlemagne and West and others. And there were alliances made between these two political powers. And was also provided for Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land, set up some hostels so people would have places to stay as they went on pilgrimages. Set up a hospital, he created an observatory, and was truly a model for later Islamic emperors. And so some very positive relationships are existing between Christian rulers and Islamic rulers in the West. In the East, it's a different story. Despite these kind of positive interactions between Islam and Christianity, and Islamdom as a political power, and Christendom, the relationship with the Byzantine Empire, that Eastern Empire, was almost completely antagonistic. Largely because there had been an effort in the West to stop Islam in the 700s from spreading any further than Spain. And so there was this political effort that had stopped Muslim expansion. In the East, however, there was this continual push to get further and further into the Byzantine Empire. By the time of the 11th century, so especially the end of the 1000s, the Abbasid dynasty was starting to break up. There are these little statelets instead of a solidified power, and there's civil wars that are going on. And a small Asiatic tribe known as the Seljuk Turks, who had recently converted to Islam, sought to gain power. They took over the Abbasid capital of Baghdad and began to expand their territory, especially moving into the Byzantine territory. And so in the year 1095, the Byzantine emperor, a man named Alexis I, appealed to the Pope, Pope Urban II, for help. Essentially, the goal was for the western part of Europe to help the Byzantine Empire against this Muslim invasion. And so Urban called for a crusade, sometimes referred to as a military pilgrimage, that was to stop Muslim expansion in the east and also take back control of the Holy Land, which had been under Muslim control for several centuries by this point. In order to get people involved in the crusade, to join these armies that would be traveling, the Pope and other religious leaders made a lot of promises to them. First, the Pope promised that anyone who would become a crusader would have their property and their family protected by the papacy. They wouldn't need to worry about losing their land, losing their property. They wouldn't need to worry about their family not having food. Right? The crusaders' families would be taken care of. There were also promises that going on this crusade would have benefits in the afterlife. That if you went as a crusader, you would experience what was known as an indulgence. An indulgence referred to forgiveness regarding sins that would have sent you to purgatory. And remember, purgatory is this kind of place between heaven and hell where you would spend some time working off your sins. Right? You're not bad enough to go to hell, but you are not good enough to go to heaven, and so you end up in purgatory for a certain amount of time. Well, going on a crusade would provide you with an indulgence which would either get you totally out of purgatory or have your time cut short. And certainly if you died in the crusade, you would experience full forgiveness. And so all these promises given to people to get, religious promises, getting them to go on this military endeavor. And all of it, of course, is bathed in Christianity, right? When Urban proclaimed this crusade, supposedly the response is Deus vult. In Latin, it means God wills it. And so this became the cry of the Crusaders as they went to these lands. Right? Deus vult. God wills it. There's nothing that will stand before the Crusaders because this is God's will. People claimed to have visions and dreams about the Crusades or the need to go on the Crusades. People claimed about seeing angels and signs in their journeys. Supposedly the lance that pierced Christ's side, while he hung on the cross, was discovered. And this too is kind of this relic that is taken into battle, knowing that if they take this into battle, they will be successful. And so there is this pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Now, of course, there's this military pilgrimage that has some success. Jerusalem is recaptured in July of 1099. But we're talking about something that involves a lot of violence and a lot of atrocities. Now, often Western history has told it as a matter of Muslim atrocities on Christians. Were there atrocities, torture, other types of things done by Muslims? Yes. Were they done by people that claimed to be Christian? Yes. There was atrocity on both sides of these crusades. A lot of those things that we talked about with just war often went out the window. And so torture was used and extreme violence was used. Many of those who were involved would set up crusader states as they would free the lands from Muslim control. They would set up their own realm of power, which often sidetracked people, right? We're going to the Holy Land. Well, I'm quite satisfied here being in charge. One of the crusader states, however, was established around Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem there was a king established, the king of Jerusalem. But it also revived personal interest in pilgrimage. And so it's referred to as a military pilgrimage, but then there's also people returning to the Holy Land. With this revival of kind of common pilgrimage, several religious orders were developed, like the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitallers, who ultimately had as their mission to protect pilgrims or help pilgrims as they traveled to and from these places. Now again, doesn't always happen. Now all the stories you might hear about the Knights Templar aren't true about, I mean, they did take a lot of treasure out of the Holy Land and those kind of things. But they didn't always live up to the mission of focusing on pilgrims, right? Often it was a grasp for power, grasp for wealth, other things that took place as well.
I mean, there's not a map on the back of the Constitution.
No, it's on the back of the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, no. I don't think there is a huge, was it Washington, D.C. where they found the treasure? Oh, no, I don't want to spoil it for anybody. The international treasure, is it Washington or is it Boston? I don't know. There isn't a Knights Templar treasure buried under, Philadelphia or anything like that, right? So, but they did plunder those lands and did gather wealth and those kind of things. But they've not been controlling world events. There's no Knights Templar conspiracy or anything other. So they didn't always live up to that helping the pilgrims thing. Right? Sometimes they took their own advantage. But eventually, over the next 100 years, all of these crusader states fell. And so Muslims gradually recaptured this land. And so more and more crusades were called to try and recover these things. Richard the Lionheart tries to go out there. His attempts to try and bring some sort of negotiation fail. He's captured for a time, held for ransom. So there's a second crusade, a third crusade. The two I want to highlight are the fourth crusade and what's known as the Children's Crusade. Often, now remember, the first crusade is called by the Byzantine emperor. He wants help, right? And so he begs Urban II to help him. But the actions of the crusaders in some of those later crusades were often directed to Byzantine Christians and not just Muslims. During the Fourth Crusade, crusaders pillaged Constantinople, right, which is a Christian-controlled city. They replaced the Patriarch of Constantinople with a bishop from the West, a Catholic bishop. They forced Eastern Christians to observe Western Catholic rituals. And as you might suspect, that kind of led to a lot of hard feelings towards Catholic Christians because, these are supposed to be two Christian groups. The Children's Crusade involved thousands of children from France and the Netherlands going to the Holy Land to try and reconquer it. Why would you send children to do this? Well, essentially the ideas were the innocence of children, the holiness of children, the belief that God would protect them. But of course, many of those children died. Some of them were sold into slavery. And so there's failures here, not just in establishing the goal, but in what happened to some of those individuals.
What was the age group of these children?
I don't think they were like 3 and 4. I think we're talking about, if I remember correctly, that kind of 10 to 13, 15, 16 age. So not really, really young children, but
Never sent to the Holy Land?
Yeah. One last political involvement of Christians in the later Middle Ages that kind of extends really into the later period is what's known as the Reconquista. This refers to the attempt to recapture Spain for Christian control. We've already briefly mentioned how the Islamic conquest of Spain had been halted in the 8th century by a man named Charles Martel. Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne. And this had taken place at the Battle of Tours. Now in Spain, under Islamic control, Jews and Christians did have some religious freedom. As we've talked about, in some of those places, paying of a tax would allow you to maintain your own religious leaders and practice your own religion. But Islamic culture and religion spread throughout Spain. Lots of people converted, but there was a profound effect on Spanish culture. So if you even today, looking at Spanish culture, people can point out Islamic influence. Some Christians in Spain even adopted Arabic as the language that they would speak, and also the language of their liturgy, which is still a practice in some places, not many, some places today. Just kind of as a sidelight, tangent, not something specifically related here, but one of the things that's often emphasized in anti-Islamic, anti-Islamic websites and literature and those kind of things, is the emphasis placed on the Arabic Allah, or Allah, you might hear referred to kind of anglicized. And they'll say, Muslims worship Allah and He's the moon god, and that's what that name means. Well, Christians and Jews who speak Arabic also use Allah, who refer to God. So there's not something exotic about Allah for Muslims, but it has to do with this influence of Islamic power. And so even people that would recite in Arabic the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed or something like that in Arabic would use Allah to refer to God. So again, that continued influence of Arabic even on Christianity. The two kingdoms in Spain, Castile and Aragon, kind of joined forces to try and push the Muslims out. However, especially in the early years, there's as much fighting among Christians as there is between Christians and Muslims. And this attempt to reconquer Spain takes 4 centuries, from the 11th century until the end of the 15th century. By the end of the medieval period, there were, in the early church, there were 5 very important cities that had patriarchates or very important bishops. Jerusalem, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch of Syria, and Constantinople. These were the 5 great patriarchates, the 5 great sees, S-E-E-S, as it's known in the West. By the end of the Middle Ages, the only one not under Roman control, the only one not under Muslim control was Rome. And so all the other of these ancient centers of Christianity that had been so honored by early Christians had largely fallen to Muslims.
Can you repeat this?
Jerusalem, Rome, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch of Syria, and Constantinople. Now we'll actually talk about the fall of Constantinople in the next section, the end of the Middle Ages, because it's the 15th century when that falls to Muslims.
And Rome was the only one at this time.
Yeah, so by that end of the medieval period, by the 1500s, Rome is the only one not controlled by Muslims. Any other questions about Christianity and politics in this later medieval period?